somebody's not happy. And so it will have a tendency to not want to glide as easily. So that
and people of my age have a tendency to think everything was better.
That's a great question. People sometimes have a tendency to see the problems being solved in...
Because they do have a tendency to sensationalize stuff. They do have an ability.
Cycles, they have a tendency to get 4 cycles, and it takes us longer.
Have a tendency to trail off into silence when I come up to them, but
They don't want
to, we have a tendency to blame everything on some other group of people.
States, we have a tendency to assume that the United States is all that there is.
That when bitten, humans have a tendency to fight back around a very sensitive and vulnerable region of said shark's body. So,
the main thing you do is bank regulation. You're going to have a tendency to kind of skimp on that because nobody.
Here's the challenge. We have a tendency to convince ourselves to think, well, I'm not as bad as some people. I would say you have a tendency to attack more when you're in a country.
Sometimes you have a tendency to kind of glorify that machine, and you will be.
My quilting, I have a tendency to do small, little.
What people have a tendency to do is they start to feel better, and as they feel better, they decide that it's no longer important.
Sometimes when we talk about the science and research on board the station, we have a tendency to think about the things that we see.
I mean, I've been in this business for 30 years.
Right.
And economists have a tendency to take the most recent experience and extrapolate.
By the people they liked and knew. I mean, humans have a tendency to trust more things that come from trusted sources than...
Listen, but for some reason we have a tendency to not really want to hear.
Miners a lot of times have a tendency to want to show themselves off more than the content.
Also, Eric and Boris have a tendency to run on Grinnell time. For instance, at 8:01, I think Boris...
And we have a tendency to just, someone says, I'm a farmer,
I have a tendency to think, at least in today's terms, of Islam as being rather...
Do we not also have a tendency to see them ever so slightly as cardboard cutouts?
They have a tendency to release their bladder.
We have a tendency to do so often to say, well, that's them.
As well, people have a tendency to revert back to their family roles, and that can
and their old family
have a tendency to take risks. They do. They take more risks.
Because we have a tendency to think, well, Rahab is mentioned in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11.
Humans have a tendency to assume that the safest option is to preserve the status quo.
Have a tendency to present the professor as a befuddled, chalk-covered, impotent half.
Great deal. We have a tendency to drive their prices up.
Yes.
Yeah,
I was...
We have a tendency to sort of focus on that, but remember, the